Okay, so we are live. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the latest session of Ideas Conclave. We are absolutely honored and delighted to have been the company of a former foreign minister, a diplomat, an economist, an educationist, Mr. Sartaj Aziz. The session will be moderated by Mr. Ejaz Haider, who I'm sure most of you, if not all, will be familiar with. He is a regular commentator on issues of defense and foreign policy. He is a journalist and he is currently associated with Indus News. Thank you so much, the two of you, for taking out the time and to speak to our students. And over to you, Ejaz. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. It's great to be here and moderating the Ideas Conclave of the University of Central Punjab. I welcome everyone who is logged in for this session. As mentioned, our guest this afternoon is Mr. Sartaj Aziz. I have had the pleasure and honor of knowing Sartaj Sahib for a fairly long time. For most people, he's a leading light of Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and has at various times held the portfolios of finance and foreign ministries, also planning commission. Personally, I also think his party should have nominated him to become the president of Pakistan during the 2013-18 tenure. And there's a reason why I say this, because it would not only have been the deserved acme of Sartaj Sahib's life and career, but the office itself, I think, would have been elevated by the presence of someone whose career has been exemplary and in the true sense of the word, and in the service of this country. But that said, Sartaj Sahib is not just a politician. I think he has been best described by engineer Ejaz Khan, who's another erudite friend. And I can do no better than to reproduce Khurram's words. And I quote from what Khurram wrote, and this was a review of Sartaj Sahib's book. It is difficult to find another Pakistani who has served as a bureaucrat, official of an international organization, scholar and researcher, senator, principal office holder of a political party, originator of an historic amendment to the Constitution, Minister of Finance, Foreign Affairs and Planning, educator and university chancellor, and of course, author. So it is indeed difficult to find another personality with that kind of mix. So let's dive right into the purpose of today's session. We are discussing the second updated edition of Sartaj Sahib's book, Between Hopes and Realities. But the book is not just a memoir. It's also an analysis by Sartaj Sahib of how Pakistan has fared. The milestones as also the turning points, and I'm using his terms, because Sartaj Sahib's life and career have paralleled the ebbs and flows of this country. The format is simple. I will request Sartaj Sahib to give us a 15-minute overview of the book and its purpose, what he describes on page 485 as the lessons of history. He has listed 4. Once he is done, I'll have a brief interaction with him and then open the session to questions from the online audience. You can ask questions in either English or Urdu, but keep them brief so we can have as many questions as possible. We have about 75 minutes for the session and we would like to make the most of that time. So without further ado, let me request Sartaj Sahib to give us his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks for this opportunity. For me, writing this book was not a matter of choice, but one of compulsion. And the compulsion was basically threefold. First, I would call it a hereditary compulsion. I inherited it. My grandfather, as I said, wrote his accumulated knowledge called Ilajul Qalb, published in 1914. My father published his life story in 1946 under the title, What is Man and What He Ought to Do. So this was a legacy that I had to keep up. Secondly, having been a witness to history at first hand from close quarters and participated in the political and economic life of the country from a ringside seat, I felt it is my duty to record my version of the events and decisions so that I leave lessons for the next generation. Thirdly, in the last few years, particularly in the 90s, people started talking of Pakistan as a failed state. Steve Cohen even challenged the very idea of Pakistan in his book, Idea of Pakistan. And belonging to that shrinking generation, which actually saw the birth of Pakistan, I thought I must share my conviction with the younger generation that the idea of Pakistan is not only valid, but inshallah will never die. So these were the three factors which motivated me to write this book. Now, the first edition of this book was published in 2009. And the first chapter is actually autobiographical, because this book is not just an autobiography, it's a brief one-volume concise history of Pakistan. So the first volume is the only autobiographical in which I describe my early life. The second chapter gives a summary of Pakistan's milestones and turning points. Now, milestone is a major political or economic event which has far-reaching impact on the country's future sort of course of action. Turning point is a much bigger event, which is caused either by external factors or internal conversions. The creation of Pakistan, for example, was a major milestone, just as its breakup in 1971 was a negative milestone when East Pakistan got created. And in between, there were many positive milestones and negative milestones. And anybody interested in history should be aware of these milestones and also understand the causes of why it happened, particularly the negative milestone, because those are the ones we wish to avoid. The third chapter is called The Shattered Dream. That chapter describes why East Pakistan became Bangladesh. There are not many authentic accounts of that from the Pakistan side, so I made my contribution to explain why East Pakistan became Bangladesh. Chapter 4 then describes sort of in a very simplified form the coming up of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's period from 1972 to 1977. And chapter 5 then deals with Ziaul Haq's 11 years military rule, 8 direct and 3 indirect. So these are brief chapters before I came back to politics. After this, in '84, when I rejoined politics, then it's a more detailed first-hand account after this. So the next 5 chapters describe the next 5 regimes. Muhammad Khan Junejo from 1985 to 88, then Benazir Bhutto from 88 to 90, then Nawaz Sharif from 90 to 93, then again Benazir Bhutto from 93 to 96, and Nawaz Sharif from 97 to 99. These 5 chapters then describe these particular period with a lot of interesting events and crises and some achievements. Then the chapter after this, we have Muhammad Khan Junejo's chapter. After that, when these finish, then we have my tenure in the Foreign Office, which I call Foreign Office, a melting pot of global fault lines. And then chapter 11 after that is the, chapter 12 after that is the Kargil chapter, the Kargil war, because I was a witness to that major crisis. And then chapter 13 covers General Musharraf's 11-year rule, 8 years direct and 3 years indirect. So that had completed the first edition of this book in 2009. Now in the second edition, I've added 4 chapters. Chapter 14 covering the period of Asif Ali Zardari's rule from 2008 to 2013. Then Nawaz Sharif's third tenure as Prime Minister from 2013 to 2018. Chapter 16 deals with FATA, merger of FATA with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Since I was responsible for this process, and it's, in my view, an historic process leading to the turning point of the 25th Amendment of the Constitution. Therefore, I thought I must record all the factors and processes by which this was accomplished. And chapter 17, the final chapter, deals with Imran Khan's 2-year tenure that completes the book. Then there are 2 epilogues. The first epilogue was the first edition and the second epilogue. In the first epilogue, I deal with, at some length, with the civil-military relations and the causes of failure of democracy. And that chapter also contains, incidentally, my letter to Steve Cohen of 2003, in which I explained try to take up issues with him why the idea of Pakistan is still valid and relevant, and those who are interested would find that letter very interesting. But epilogue 2 then carries on and points out that the ingress of military in the affairs of Pakistan has become even more extended, and it is virtually hybrid plus now, and it has reached virtually a dead end, and it needs to be resolved to have a framework in which the people of Pakistan and the voters decide who will rule Pakistan for the next 5 years. And the other issues which deal with it, particularly issues of provincial autonomy and human rights and a large number of other issues which we face, including the security challenges, cannot be resolved except through a proper system in which the parliament is effective and the provincial governments and the local bodies, they are all the tiers. So I've suggested in the end a grand national dialogue sponsored by the parliament and major stakeholders to evolve such a system. So this sort of is a summary of all the chapters of the book. Then, as you said in your introduction, that I've presented 4 lessons of our history for the future. First, that the country can survive as a viable political entity only through a genuine democratic system. 2, a genuine democratic system means the rule of law, in which, as a matter of, it cannot be delivered by a continuing military rule with a civilian facade. And thirdly, it requires institutions, strong democratic institutions, which will ensure, first of all, that the provincial rights and the human rights are protected, and that all the institutions of state, the 3 pillars of state, function within their constitutional framework. And fourth, that the vitality of a nation does not come only from the size of its economy or its military strength, but of its shared values and its social energy and its common sense of purpose. And the classical definition of a nation in which there is one language and one culture is now superseded by a multidimensional concept in which a multiplicity of cultures and ethnicities and others combine together and are harmonized through a democratic process, which lends then vitality to the vitality of the nation. And that is what we lack today in becoming a full nation. So these are the lessons I have presented. They require more detailed study in the book, and I hope those who are interested as students of history will find it of some interest to draw their own lessons, particularly the younger generation.
Right. That kind of positions us for the discussion. Interestingly, on a side note, Sartaj, since you mentioned the late Steve Kahn's idea of Pakistan, I was one of the manuscript reviewers. This was when I was working with Steve at the Brookings Institution. This is back in 2002, 2003. It actually started as a coffee table book, but then it kept expanding, and Steve, went on to add, as you know, multiple scenarios in terms of Pakistan's future. But okay, so the 4 lessons that you've talked about, and they are like essentially the quintessential lessons, if I may, in terms of the various ebbs and flows and your own personal interaction, and also directly as a practitioner and also as a ringside viewer, as you mentioned. So let me play the devil's advocate here. And I'm not being what you describe as the pro-army camp, but I'd still, for the sake of sort of, more rigor, posit that I would consider what you describe as genuine democracy to mean liberal democracy, liberal constitutional democracy, not something which is only a form, but something with a lot of substance. For instance, on our eastern side, we have a state that has gone through elections. that has had no military takeovers whatsoever, except for a brief interregnum, 2-year interregnum of Mrs. Gandhi's emergency. But frankly, we cannot describe that country as it stands today as a liberal democracy from what's going on there. So give us a sense that this particular social and constitutional compact that forms liberal democracies, there's a historical trajectory, and in that historical trajectory, there are also many accidents. So give us a sense of those turning points that you talk about, which, if they had gone differently, we would probably have been taken a different trajectory.
Well, as you know, democracy, as Churchill said, is the worst subject, but there's nothing better. So it is not something that is easy to evolve and is not a perfect system. And it takes time to develop, as you saw from the Arab Spring, for example. People thought the moment the monarchs and the kings fall, there will be democracy, but those institutions, take time. And then you see when there are tensions, external or others, then of course, the tolerance that democracy requires is not there. And the whole approach to democracy requires a much more mature and tolerant system. Now, in our case, the most important thing is that if we had had, say, 12, 13, 14 elections in these 70 years, we would have a new breed of leadership coming from the grassroots. And that would have had a major impact. And we may have had outstanding leaders like Mahathir Mohamad came in Malaysia, now Erdogan in Turkey, and that would have had a major impact. In our case, almost most of our leaders are the products of a military managed system, because when they transfer power, they don't transfer power, they share power, and they're looking for a pliable leader who would give them the civilian facade. And if Zulfikar Ali Bhutto becomes too strong, then he's hanged. And then if somebody else becomes even stronger, then he's exiled. So we have not had the kind of leadership. In India, that advantage was there. And this is because the Indian freedom movement lasted much longer. Ours started much later for a separate homeland. And so they had a much bigger pool of leadership that was there. And in our case, the leadership after the first lot, Quaid-e-Azam died much earlier, very soon after Pakistan was created in 1949, and Liaquat Ali Khan 3 years later. And then that's why Ayub Khan and military intervened, and then bureaucracy came. So this is the first major factor in our case, that we did not have the kind of elections that we would have had. Our first election took place 23 years after Pakistan was created in 1970. And that's why you see we didn't develop the rules. Thirdly, we are 4 provinces, and there are, of course, the basic factors that intervened in our case, which created East Pakistan, because we did not have the democratic process that continued. And the political parties which were here were also present there, and many parties had won the elections in 1970. East Pakistan may not have become Bangladesh. So again, you see the unity of the country depends on this. And even in a limited way, you can see that martial law, which we have had in 35, 36 years directly, and many years of indirect rule. After the Ayub Khan's successful economic reforms and rule, East Pakistan became Bangladesh because they were not managing their own affairs. And in a democracy, not only the provinces, but lower bodies also manage their own affairs. And that is why under Ziaul Haq's rule, if you recall, the Sindhu Desh movement started, Pakistan Liberation Army started, because the military rule creates that sense of deprivation. So in that sense, the unity of the country, the unity of the federation requires a democratic framework, even if it's not fully functional and adequate. So in our case, I think the commitment to democracy among the people is very strong. If you allow it to function without interruption for a length of period, I'm sure we can develop strong institutions and a reasonably good democratic system.
Right. I'm still playing the devil's advocate, by the way. So let's take the three aspects of the argument that you presented. One is about uninterrupted elections. If we accept that, then we can begin to problematize it in the sense that take India once again. I'm taking India's example. So you have a leader of the stature and approach of Jawaharlal Nehru and the constitutional founding father, Mr. Ambedkar. And they have had continuous elections. And they have reached a point where they have people like Amit Shah and Narendra Modi. So that's one thing. So I would humbly present that perhaps continuous elections per se or in and of itself may not lead to good leadership. Secondly, the issue of Mahathir Mohamad and Erdogan. Many people would say that neither is democratic by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, economically, both countries have developed. And as a matter of fact, there is this, you were part of the planning commission during President Ayub's period, and you talk about it, and you talk about Pakistan's economic development, even though there was no democracy per se. But then you talk about the fact that the 1965 war basically, put an end in many ways to that experiment. And thirdly, about unity. Now, while accepting your argument, I would say that a lot of that, and I'm talking about the territorial integrity of a state, also depends on factors other than simply a consensus, a socio-political consensus. Take, for example, China. Xinjiang would probably want to go its own way. Tibet Autonomous Region would probably want to go its own way. Hong Kong would probably want to go back to status quo ante. But none of these regions can do that because the Chinese central state is extremely powerful. And there's no way that it will allow any challenge to its territorial integrity. So my point is that perhaps we need to rethink this a little more. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think, first of all, you see, Pakistan is located in a very volatile region. And this is a region in which 4 empires have collapsed in the last 100-some years. The Ottoman Empire, and the British Empire, and then the Soviet Union, and now the American. And it is naturally has an impact on its neighbors. And in that sense, if you compare Pakistan to the other Muslim countries in the region, you can see all the trouble spots and unstable parts today are in this part of the world, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Syria, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Yemen, and so on and so forth. It is really tragic that we are facing Libya, facing this situation. In that sense, Pakistan is still, we have managed to control our insurgency, because these are factors. The insurgency came here because of the neighboring areas. First, Palestinian problem, that's why I call it the fault line, melting pot of global fault line, which have traveled to us. So one has to take into account that factor also. Secondly, China is a homogeneous. I've written, of course, one of my ambitions was when I started as a development economist, development professional under Quaid-e-Azam direct instruction that you should pay more industry to commerce and industry. I wanted to make an original contribution to the store of human knowledge. And that's why my book on China, which was published in 1978, distilled how China became what it did. There are many other historic factors, which distinguish those races from the races of the subcontinent, which are very different, and they go much deeper into the causes why China and Pakistan are different. But thirdly, considering the fact that we have some semblance of a representative institution in Pakistan, in this part of the world, through municipal corporations, municipalities. In fact, Pakistan got created because Quaid-e-Azam argued that in the municipal services, Muslims should have separate seats. And in the 20s, that was accepted. And so that mini democracy, kept functioning. And that's why when the 35 Act was passed, it provided for separate Muslim seats. And in 46, when we won those seats, 85% of them, the Muslim seats, the Muslim League, we became the representative, and our demand for Pakistan could not be ignored. So we have that tradition, and therefore, unlike Egypt, where democracy didn't last even 2 years, we have that possibility. Secondly, in our case, when you want national unity, as I explained earlier, that because people were not managing their own affairs, it was over-centralized. East Pakistan became Bangladesh. And the same could happen here. But democracy, allows people to participate in their respective spheres, and therefore comes up. So we may not have a perfect democracy in the coming years, but you allow this tree to be nurtured. If you uproot it every 10 years, then it can't take roots. So once it develops strong roots, then traditions develop, then people who don't respect the rules of democracy are rejected by the voters. And let that happen, let that be the deciding factor, not somebody else. So I think I still feel strongly that if we give it time, we allow the electoral process to go on, our judiciary and other parliament, other institutions function properly, we could have a reasonably good functioning democracy in Pakistan in the coming years.
Right. Now, let me change tack a little, because I think the students who are online would also want to hear a little bit about your personal life. So it's interesting, your mother passed away when you were very young. Probably, if I remember correctly, you were 4 or 5 when she passed away. So you had been, and you were raised and you were mentored by your sister, who in her own right, a very accomplished lady. And then when you went for the Central Superior Services exam, interestingly, you got the police service of Pakistan. And you were not particularly happy with that. And you ultimately landed in military accounts. Now, going by today's sort of approaches, no one would want to shift from the police service of Pakistan to military lands and accounts. So just give us a sense, of your sister, who was your mentor, who literally mothered you in so many ways, and then this sort of reluctance to be a police officer and end up in accounts.
You see, first of all, my sister was a great human being and a great writer, and she died last year, and less than a year ago. And so she was my mentor and guide. And in the beginning, she used to, whatever book she would read, she would sort of give me a gist. So she developed this interest of reading very early in me, and writing also. Her first short story was published before she was passed as her metric. So it was, and then when she reached Lahore, her first novel was published in 1954, Nagri Nagri Pira Musafir, and introduced us to the circle of literary giants in Lahore, which was a very good thing. And surprisingly, she came to Lahore because the whole of Northwest Province, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, did not have a single girls' college at that time. And because of that, I also had to come to Lahore. When I arrived in Lahore, the Pakistan movement was at its full swing, particularly in Islamic College, Lahore, where I joined in 1944. And that also was an important thing. And I sort of matured prematurely, in the sense that at the age of 16, 17, young people, are doing other things. And I got immersed in politics. So it added, to a certain seriousness to my purpose of life. And that, I think, again, I traveled in a number of years in those 2 years. And then when in 46, Quaid-e-Azam came to Islamic College, Lahore, and for the annual prize distribution, and I had the honor of receiving first prize for my class from him. He said, Muslims are very backward in commerce and industry, and so you should pay more attention. Next day, when we went to Mamdot Villa to call on him as a delegation of the Muslim Student Federation, I said, sir, what can we do for commerce and industry? You should ask these rich landlords to commerce and industry. So he did a cigar and said, my dear boy, diversion first didn't mean diversion in studies. So we said, oh, Quaid-e-Azam wants to study commerce, and we discovered there was a Haley College of Commerce in Lahore. So next day, 12 of us went there, and we found that out of 350 boys, only 3 are Muslims, and one teacher out of 20. So that's how we landed there and had no halal meat kitchen. 10 of it got admission, and so that was the experience through which we started studying more seriously a subject like accountancy and commercial law. Then I was underage for CSS when I finished my BCom. So I accepted the offer to Officers Commission, Deputy Director Information, Government of NW. Qayyum Khan was the Chief Minister at that time. And as Deputy Director Information, I was traveling with journalists with the Chief Minister everywhere he went throughout the province. And in the 1951 elections, I noticed that all the deputy commissioners who helped with the election in one way or another were rewarded, and those who were honest and did not do so were transferred to unfavorable posts. And that disgusted me completely. So that was one reason why I did not want to deal. And I saw how police officers who were traveling with us also were suspicious and worried. So I sort of developed this passion for dealing with ideas rather than people. And I saw that if you make a good commercial policy or prepare a good budget, you can influence the whole country. As a deputy commissioner, you are dealing with a small area. So in those 2 years, my mind was made up. And let's not forget that in the early 50s, and I'm talking about, the country was ruled by the Art and Accounts officers. Ghulam Muhammad, the Governor General, was from Art and Accounts. Chaudhry Muhammad Ali was from the Art and Accounts. Zahid Hussain, Mumtaz Hassan, Abdul Qadir, a whole string of people. There's only one from the ICS, which is Akhtar Hussain. Otherwise, so I said, this is the model that I wish to follow. So that's how I ended up in the account service. But it was very good because I got selected as secretary of the reorganization committee, and I got my promotion as deputy secretary within 9 years, joint secretary within 14 years, so much earlier than my other batches. So it was a good career.
So this scholarly bent of mind that you obviously had from an early age on, I'm assuming that was because of your sister. You also, and I remember, I was actually quite surprised some years ago when you and I were sitting at your place in Islamabad, and you told me about your work on China, which you completed at the University of Sussex. In fact, it became a textbook of sorts in many universities of the world. So tell us, how did you sort of square all your other responsibilities with this desire to do research and to be a scholar? Just give us a sense of that, because I'm sure the students would love to hear you talk about that.
You see, first of all, the other influence my grandfather's book had on me, and when my father gave me a copy of that book, Ilajul Qalb, he said the main purpose of this book is to tell you to avoid anything that harms your body, mind, or soul. And so I was in school, and I would ask him, what is it that harms our body? Obviously, sleeping late, or having intoxicants, gambling, things of that kind. But what will harm your mind, and what will harm your spirit, your soul? So those were more difficult discussions of how. But as a result, I discovered that smoking is bad for your health, liquor is bad for your health. So I've never touched them throughout my life. And then habits, simple habits of sleeping early and getting up early, etc. And so this kind of something which gave me a regulated life. And I every time did something, I will ask myself, is it harming my soul or my mind? So that gave me a more disciplined life. Then as I went along, my commitment to serve Pakistan, Quaid-e-Azam was my first passion. What can I do to become memoir-e-Pakistan, as Quaid-e-Azam wanted? So whatever I did very diligently. Now, at that time, I may not have known as to what is happening or what does it add up to. But as I went along and did small assignments, I kept getting selected for better and better assignments. So because I was diligent and I was efficient in most of the things I did. So I got promotion much earlier. So in 1971, when this East Pakistan crisis was coming, I was in the Planning Commission at that time, fairly important. Throughout the last few years, 67, 68, I did my best. I could see the storm brewing up in our face. And Mahbub ul Haq was my colleague and Moin Bakai, and we had a very good team in the Planning Commission. And we tried our best to give more resources to East Pakistan. Railway was divided, Wabda was divided. But then we realized that the political, and I had the misfortune of being in Dhaka on the 25th of March, one day before the military take over their military action that began. So I saw those things, from close quarters. So that is why in 71, when the offer came, I just few months before Bangladesh, I went to FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. And within 1 year, the world food crisis broke. And it was a major, I was head of the Commodities and Trade Division where all this research work was done. So that is when I tried to explore why are people hungry in some countries and what are the real causes of hungry. It was not shortage of food, it was a lack of development. It was poverty. So once I was doing that assignment, now I began to explore the causes of poverty and why development happens in one place and not happen in another place. And very soon, I accompanied my Director General to China in 1973 because the food conference was coming in 74, which was a major exercise for me. And I began to understand. It was a new world for me when I saw that. Before that, in 67, I had gone to China during the Cultural Revolution, which had a major impact on me. And that's why when I came to FAO, those links developed. So you can see that if you are doing any work seriously, as a professional, you go deeper into it and you find out the contours of that particular problem. Then you begin to think of why this is happening. And so obviously, I wrote an article in 73, Chinese approach to rural development, which was published in many languages. Then in 76, I went to Sussex to write this book. And ever since then, I must have had 20 visits to China, and I've observed it as we go along. And the Western world has not paid enough attention to the Chinese model because they are uncomfortable. But it's unprecedented what they have achieved. So that is why even today, whenever I have a problem to discuss, I always think, what will China do about such a problem? So that is how I came to this whole new dimension of development experience that came from China.
Right. So what I'm going to do now is, because I also want our moderator here from the university to sort of get the students to question you. But quickly, 2 or 3 milestones. There's the nuclear explosions, Kargil, and one of your really great achievements personally, which are FATA reforms. So just give us a quick overview of, because Kargil, you actually landed in Delhi the day the Indian newspapers had sort of, printed that entire story about the telephonic conversation between then Army Chief General Musharraf and then Chief of General Staff, General Aziz. And it was obviously, it made your job even more difficult. So just give us a quick, brief overview of the nuclear. That's when you were the finance minister, and Kargil and this FATA reforms.
Well, the nuclear test, of course, is a very major case study in decision making in our case. And it was, first of all, it's quite remarkable that Pakistan decided very early after the Indian nuclear test of 1974 to develop within 1 year, 75, when Munir Ahmed came from there, and then Ejaz Khan came from Brussels, from Holland. The basic decision at that time to match India's response was very important, because over the years, we had with great difficulty maintained a 1-to-3 ratio in conventional weapons, which is enough. And this is one of the things, which bothered me from 1965 onwards. In the 65 war, I discovered that our economic strength, our economic capacity, there's a mismatch between that and our diplomatic and defense strategies. You can't, with this economic strength, you can't manage those. And this preoccupation, this mismatch has been my preoccupation throughout the period. And that's why later on I tried to create the National Security Council Committee to bring these things together. But this was one of the things. So I think people realize that in conventional strength, even if you maintain 1-to-3 ratio and spend twice as much on your defense as India, because India is 7 times larger. So if you're maintaining one third, you are spending twice as much as India on defense. And therefore, that is one of the reasons why our economic growth was much slower. So as a result, therefore, the decision to go nuclear was very sensible. We, at the same time, went to the General Assembly throughout the 80s asking for declaring South Asia a nuclear-free zone, but nobody was able to enforce that. So quietly, we were doing this. So in 1998, when India did this nuclear test, we had absolutely no choice but to go for it, although we were under great pressure from elsewhere. And so the manner in which that decision was made is quite remarkable, because Nawaz Sharif was under tremendous pressure to accept, the package of aid and other facilities that were being offered to us. But what would have happened to Pakistan if we had not done so is a very difficult question. So my chapter on this particular factor is a very good case study for those who want to do case study in government decision making in that chapter of Nawaz Sharif, chapter 8. Then Kargil was a very sad story. It's a very major disaster that we suffered. And it's the second largest chapter in my book, which I've described in great detail of how this thing happened. And how a military leader, without taking into confidence the political leadership or the Foreign Office, undertook such a major misadventure, which caused irreparable damage to the Kashmir's cause as well as to other things. So this is again something which is worth reading. Then finally, the FATA reforms was a very, in my view, a very positive turning point in our history. If we had done these reforms 25 years ago and consolidated the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan, what we suffered in the last 20 years would not have happened. But the British, of course, did not want to build roads or make FATA connectable because of the Russian factors. And after partition, we didn't have enough troops to guard this boundary, and so we were more concerned about the eastern boundary. So therefore, we allowed it to remain, semi-governed no man's land. And so after 9/11, when people started being thrown out of there, they came and occupied a good part of our federal areas. And as you recall, in 2009, they said only 70 kilometers from Islamabad, as the crow flies, they have reached. So when we were working on our manifesto for the 2013 elections, I was the chairman of the manifesto committee. So I specially added a paragraph, the mainstreaming of FATA as a primary goal for our party. And so it took a couple of years before we came to that issue. And then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif set up a committee under my chairmanship with the Minister of Law, Minister of States and Frontier Regions, the National Security Advisor. And we examined the issues, the efforts made at reforms for the last 70 years in great depth. And I realized that political mainstreaming cannot happen without administrative mainstreaming, then the legal mainstreaming, and then the security mainstreaming. So there are different dimensions of FATA. Unless they are right sequenced and complement each other, FATA reforms cannot take place. And all the other efforts were piecemeal, trying to attend one thing or another. So we needed a transition period of some kind. Somebody said 10 years, somebody said, we said 3 to 5 years. And thank God we achieved a consensus in 2018 to go ahead, and we had to work very hard to finish the process. And it happened one day before our government finished its tenure on 31st May, the 25th Constitution Amendment. So in the report, I've described in detail what were the stages through which this thinking process went and how we achieved this objective.
Right. Let me find out if there are any questions from the students. On the screen, it just seems to be you and me. So, okay, it seems that there are no questions from the students. So, let me go back to asking a few more questions myself. So, just going back to Kargil, one of the things that had happened was the Lahore process, in which then Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee came to Lahore. And by all measures, and I think most analysts are agreed on this, that was a major breakthrough. Now, what is your assessment of where that process might have gone in the event that Kargil had not happened?
You see, my feeling is that Atal Bihari Vajpayee felt that there is an historic opportunity to deal with the Kashmir issue and bring peaceful relations between India and Pakistan. And so when he met Mr. Nawaz Sharif in New York a year earlier in September 1998, it was a very interesting meeting, lunch meeting hosted by Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And Nawaz Sharif told him, Mr. Prime Minister, we can't expect foreign secretaries and bureaucrats to solve this problem. It is you and me at the political level. So if you move one step, I'll move 2 steps. And let's try to deal with this subject. And then they met separately and decided that let's introduce a back channel. He will nominate one person and India will nominate one person. And they will then explore through the back channel what options are available. So Niaz Naik and Misra, they were nominated, and they explored that what is called the Chenab process, which means that area west of Chenab becomes India, and sort of the east of Chenab becomes India, Jammu along with that, and the rest becomes this. And they had made reasonably good progress, and that is why when and this idea of the bus service was also discussed at that New York meeting, which took place in September '98. That why not start a bus service so that people keep coming and going. So now when the bus service was ready after 4 months, a journalist asked Mr. Nawaz Sharif, would you welcome Vajpayee on the first bus? He said, of course, that will be a very good beginning. And Vajpayee said, yes. So on 21st of February, then he came by that bus service. And that is when they decided to, and that agreement, the Lahore Declaration says, both sides agree to intensify discussions on resolving all issues between them, including the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. Now they don't even accept, and this was a major breakthrough, therefore, the Lahore process, that they agreed to deal with it seriously. So they also asked both the foreign ministers, me and Jaswant Singh, to pursue the options, that come. So within a month, we met in Sri Lanka. We had gone for SAARC foreign ministers meeting, and we explored without changing our formal position of what can happen. And Jaswant Singh says, well, we don't want to go to Hindu majority and Muslim majority once again. So I mentioned that Janab formula is geographical formula, but all the Muslim majority areas are on the west of Janab, and the Hindu majority areas are on the west of Janab. So let's convert that. And we had almost agreed to deal with it on a sort of next, explore these options, because I said 12 months, Nawaz Sharif has still 3 more years, and that is going to be difficult at that stage. And so let's try to solve something within the next 8 to 12 months. And we agreed to meet somewhere in London, Geneva, New York, wherever we are, to pursue the discussion. But within less than a month, 17th April 99, the Vajpayee government fell at that time. And even then, we would have resumed the discussion if Kargil had not happened in May 98. So in that sense, it interrupted a very important process, because we may have had a reasonable solution. And it was not that we would have given away Kashmir. It was to give, absorb those parts of Kashmir on which there is no dispute. Jammu with India, Azad Kashmir with Pakistan, and give maximum autonomy to the valley to narrow the problem for the next 5 to 10 years. And then we see what happens after that. So it was a gradual approach, but compared to where we are now, it looks such a, and even Musharraf's 4-point formula was sort of a modified version of this and could have achieved, and now we lost that opportunity also. So it's a very sad situation in which we allow historic opportunities to be diverted by issues like Kargil.
Absolutely. I'm happy you talked about the Musharraf formula, because I was about to say that that was fairly, in many ways, along the lines of the Janab formula. But give me a sense of how you look at this dispute now, since the constitutional sleight of hand that the BJP government has delivered last year, a year before that, in August 2019, with reference to the illegal annexation of an occupied territory.
Well, in chapter 17, I have discussed this Indian action at some detail, because it not only violates the international law, but also Indian constitution. And the only counter is the Kashmiri's own struggle and their defiance. And it is now, Wani's Shahadat was 2016. So you can see now almost 4.5, 5 years have passed, and yet there is no let up in their defiance and their. So whenever people, go for their right of self-determination in this determined way, it's very difficult to suppress them. So that is the only factor, combined with Pakistan diplomatic efforts, which can hopefully reverse this atrocious action which India took in the 5th of August 2019. And it is a very sad situation, the kind of suffering that the Kashmiris have undergone over this period. And I'm also very disturbed by the apathy and indifference of the international community. There are occasional noises coming here and there about human rights violation, but on the basic issues, very few countries have really spoken. So I hope that the efforts of the Kashmiris struggle, of their own struggle, will ultimately start raising the consciousness of and the sensitivity of the international community toward this issue.
Right. Now, 2 more questions before we wrap this up. And this is the updated side of your book. Of course, you analyzing the performance of the PMLN government from 2013 to 2018. And one of the criticisms, although a mild one, that I've heard from some people is that, Sartaj Saab has not really been harsh on his own government. And that, the sense that comes across is that most of the targets that were, set by the government for itself had been met. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think considering the circumstances in which our government came in, the record is quite positive. First of all, you see, as you remember, the big issue was terrorism and violent extremism. It was the number of accidents that were taking place in 2009, 10, 11, 12 was horrendous. There were a very large number of bomb blasts and other things. So, as I said in the book, that the first thing Nawaz Sharif did in the first cabinet meeting, that we cannot develop this economy unless the security situation improves. So we have to, that is my responsibility. And secondly, the energy crisis is very serious. Unless we resolve that, nothing. So these two are mine. The rest is for you, Dar Sahab, and your team. And so, and Dar Sahab, of course, in the manifesto, he was the chairman, but he was the chairman of the subcommittee on the economic program. So he was all ready. So if you look at the overall record, that Nawaz Sharif went to Karachi within 3 months in September 2013 and introduced the Rangers power and control that situation. Otherwise, the operations Arbaz backlash in Karachi would have been unbearable, and 12,000 people were apprehended in that period. Then operations Arbaz, then National Action Plan. So Pakistan is one of the few countries over that period managed to turn the corner as far as terrorism and extremism was concerned, which improved the security situation for economic revival also. And then the manner in which he dealt with the energy crisis. So these two were major achievements of that time. Then if you look at the economic record, we had a growth rate has been 3% for almost 6 years, including last 2 years of Musharraf was slow growth. And then Zardari's 5 years were also less than 3%. And we took it to 5.8%, 4.5 and 5.2. Inflation started with 9%, brought down to 4%. Tax revenues doubled from 19 billion to 38, almost to 4,000 billion. And the inflation rate, as I mentioned, also came down to 4% from 11 to 12 double-digit figures. So these were solid achievements. The only thing which did not happen successfully was exports because of several international factors, particularly after the economic crisis. And so the overall record of economy, and you can see the next 2 years have not been able to keep any of those figures at that. Finally, I think that in terms of relationship, in these 5 years, Pakistan not only became a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it developed better relations with Russia, and more importantly, the strategic upgrade of our relation with China through CPEC was a major milestone in terms of redirection of our foreign policy. And we started receiving $2, $3, $4 billion a year investment at a time when we were not receiving much from other sources, and the power sector investment and infrastructure investment. So these are very positive factors because our investment GDP ratio has started going up apart from tax GDP ratio, and now it is again static in some sense. So I've given a very objective analysis because of the propaganda, and anybody you see, and as Khurram Zakir says, it's a very balanced account of our own, and so is the scorecard of Nawaz Sharif, his strength as well as his weaknesses. So I think I've tried to be as objective as possible, even vis-a-vis my own party.
Right. So without going into the economy part of it, because frankly, I don't have any expertise in that area, but there are two other areas that you mentioned are areas where I also personally work. One, of course, the counterterrorism and the military operations, and secondly, the foreign policy side of it. So there is some evidence that Mr. Sharif responded to certain developments because those developments were those attacks were so heinous that the military was very concerned, and his hand was actually forced in terms of whether it was the National Action Plan. And the criticism also is that, for instance, NACTA never took off during Mr. Sharif's tenure. Then CPEC, because it was Xi Jinping's broader vision of the BRI, and China, of course, was prepared to have this as the flagship of BRI. So the initiative came from there. Mr. Zardari has also claimed, for instance, that the beginnings of CPEC came during his tenure. Relations with Russia joining of the SCO are also events for which the ground had already been prepared. So these are some of the criticisms that I was referring to with reference to your assessment of your party's 5-year tenure. Uh, but another very interesting chapter, of course, is on Imran Khan's government, and that government is still there. So the jury is still out. But I would like you to tell us uh, briefly, sort of give your view of what you think, especially in terms of the hybrid kind of system that we now have.
Well, on the first chapter, first points, I think unless the political leadership and the military are act together, terrorism cannot be controlled. Because as you recall, in the September period, when Nawaz Sharif, in fact, took the whole cabinet to Karachi, and we had meetings there for 2 days, in 13th and 14th September 2013, to evolve a system. And they said we can help to apprehend, but the thing has to move through the police and the Sindh government. It can't be done. So we found a mixed formula in which the rangers would be empowered. And so in this context, that law which was passed at that time, which was again renewed 2-3 times, was a very critical factor in empowering the rangers to go ahead and help. And that was very successful operation, and everybody, objective observers, acknowledged that. Similarly, Operations Arab would not have been successful unless there was full political support behind it. And I am a witness to the very large number of meetings that were held with the Army Chief and his team in preparation for the Operations Arab. And that was a combined, in other words, operation, although effort was made to reach some kind of a discussions for 3 months. But having exhausted that, and the National Action Plan was a very remarkable experience, that the tragedy of the Army Public School took place. And within 48 hours, Nawaz Sharif convened all the leaders of all political parties to come and discuss the issue. And within a week, a combined National Action Plan with consensus was evolved. And this is the kind of thing that is required, that the government and the opposition work together to achieve. So that National Action Plan. There are different reasons for why NACTA was not operationalized, and because the Army intelligence did not want to work under another organization, and now a system has been created in which it is presided over by the ISI, so it is becoming more functional. So this is a part of our structural problems that we have. So basically, I think Nawaz Sharif's role in controlling terrorism during 2013-18 is quite a very positive feature of his tenure. The other dimensions that you mentioned, I think it is true that China had an interest in, China is landlocked on 3 sides. And if you want to reach Xinjiang and that part of the world, you go from Middle East to the state of Hormuz, 10,000, 12,000 kilometers, and then come in 4,000 inland. And somewhere 2,500 kilometers, and you are in the sea. So China's interest, I remember in our the Karakoram Highway was built for this reason in the 60s and early 70s. So they were talking about it, but President Xi gave it a concrete shape in 2013. And before that, it was an idea, basically. But the manner in which Nawaz Sharif grasped this idea and ran with it, I've never seen any visit of a president being organized in such a fantastic way. The President Xi visit in April 2015, which was postponed because of the dharna. He was supposed to come in September 2014. And he personally apologized to me to convey to Mr. Nawaz Sharif why he had to postpone this thing. He had one-on-one meeting with me in Tajikistan for this purpose. And the upswing and the manner in which it took off, if you want to get $1 billion from the World Bank or Asian Bank, it takes you 4 years before the process goes on. Here, within less than 2 years, not only agreements were signed, financial close done, investment taking place, and power plants completed. I mean, it's a record because President Xi had given orders that anything to do with Pakistan and CPEC will be top priority. So the whole system, moved at that speed. And he, Sharif himself chaired meetings twice a month to make sure there are no bottlenecks or no delays. After that, there were hiccups, and the process is going much slower. So I think Nawaz Sharif does deserve the credit for upgrading the strategic relationship to a much higher level of implementation. So I think history is a judge of these things. So let's hope history will come out correctly on this.
Right, and the chapter on the current government and the hybrid system.
Well, I've said how Imran Khan's 22-year history has enabled him to come here. My basic conclusion there, I think, is my regret over political polarization. Because I think in a democratic system, opposition has a certain role to sort of stigmatize them and bracket them as, thieves and dacoits is not the best way to deal with them. The process should go on. I mentioned that in India, how many members of parliament are under trial for one thing or another. But it's not a matter of discourse in parliament or in politics. The processes are taking place independently somewhere, and let them take their own course. It should not clog the political system. So I think that is my main comment on this. And let's hope the economic policy record is not very positive in these 2 years, partly because of COVID, partly because of the way policy was conducted. But I have, of course, expressed the hope that for the sake of posterity, the economy should do better. And generally, but I'm worried about the political polarization that has taken place. And that is why there is a need for a dialogue to unclog this system and so that it can perform according to the requirements.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sartaj sir. I think it's time to wrap this up. I was hoping that there are going to be questions from the students, but either there is some issue with how this thing is being conducted, or the students have been enjoying the discussion so much that they don't want to ask questions. I have no idea. I am also in the same sort of bracket as you when it comes to these online configurations and webinars. But it's great, as always, speaking with you. And let's hope that this pathogen runs its course so that you and I can actually physically sit across from each other and talk about these things. So thank you so much. It's always great to speak with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all the audience. It's finished. You can come. I see my head is very white. We have to find a solution to this problem. No, the whole face is like that.
This is not bad.
This is better. So the side lights are the one.
So these lights should just be on half, and this almost on full.
And that can be full.
That it turned off because there was white light on it.
Anyway, we have to doctor this. Be sure there's water there. Huh?